Chapter 55 of Black Oxen by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 55. The flight next morning proved simpler of accomplishment than she had anticipated. The men were going to a neighbouring lake to fish, Larsing having excited them with the prospect of abundant trout. And why fish in your own lake, when you may take a tramp of several miles through the woods to another? They begged Clavering to go with them, and as man cannot exist for long in the rarefied atmosphere of the Empyrean without growing restive, he was feeling rather let down, and cherished a sneaking desire for a long day alone with men. But he told Mary that he did not want to go out of their woods and down to that hideous village for any such purpose as to watch her sign papers. And he stood on the landing, waving his hat, as she and Mr. Dinwiddie crossed the lake in the motor-boat to the waiting Ford. For once his intuitions failed him, and he tramped off with the other men, his heart as light as the mountain air, and his head empty of woman. Mary looked back once at the golden-brown lake, set like a jewel in its casket of fragrant trees, and wondered if she would see it again with the same eyes. She was both resentful and uneasy, although she still was unable to guess what harm could come of this interview. If Hohenhauer wanted her to go to Washington, she could refuse, and he had long since lost his old magnetic power over her. But as the Ford bumped down the steep road between the woods, she felt less like Mary Ogden every moment. Those mists of illusion to withdraw from her practical brain, returning to the heights where they belonged. She wondered how she could have dared to be so unthinkingly happy, the sport of the cynical gods, sentimental folly that she had called exaltation. After all. Could she recapture that mood when she returned? Certainly, whatever this man wanted of her, it would be hard facts, not illusions, he would invite her to deal with. But when he had been the most passionate of lovers, his brain had always seemed to stand aloof, luminous and factual. He had not an illusion. He saw life as it was, and although his manners were suave and polished, and his voice the most beautiful she had ever heard, he could be brutally direct when it suited his purpose. For a moment she hated him as ardently as she had for a time after he left her. They descended into lower and lower altitudes until the air grew intensely hot, physically depressing after the cold wine of the mountains. Finally, 10 minutes ahead of time, they drove into the doubly depressing village of Huntersville. It was no uglier than thousands of other villages and small towns that look as if built to demonstrate the American contempt for beauty, but the fact mitigated nothing to eyes accustomed to the picturesqueness of mountain villages in Europe, where the very roofs are artistic and the peasants have the grace to wear the dress of their ancestors. There were a few farms in the valley, but if Huntersville had not been a junction of sorts, it is doubtful if it would have consisted of anything but a general store, now that the saloons were closed. There was one long crooked street, with the hotel at one end, the store at the other, containing the post office, and a church, shops for automobile supplies, 2 garages, a drug store and a candy store. 8 or 10 cottages filled the interstices. Men were working in the fields, but those in Huntersville proper seemed to be exhausted with loafing. Campers going in and out of the woods, needing shelter for the night, and people demanding meals between trains, kept the dismal-looking hotel open and reasonably clean. The situation was very beautiful, for the mountains rose behind, and there was a brawling stream. Mr. Dinwiddie having ascertained that Mr. Hohenhauer had received his message and gone for a walk, leaving word he would return at 10 o'clock, Mary went into the hotel parlour to wait for him. The room was seldom used, patrons, local and otherwise, preferring the bar of happy memories, and it smelled musty. She opened the windows and glanced about distastefully. The walls were covered with a faded yellow paper, torn in places, and the ceiling was smoked and fly-specked. The worn thin carpet seemed to have been chosen for its resemblance to turtle soup squirming with vermicelli. Over the pine mantel, painted yellow, were the inevitable antlers, and on a marble-topped table were badly executed water-lilies under a glass dome. The furniture was horsehair, and she wondered how she and the Austrian statesman were to preserve their dignity on the slippery surface. Then she heard his voice in the hall, as he stopped to speak to Mr. Dinwiddie, and she glanced out curiously. She had not seen him since a year before the war, but he was little changed, improved if anything, for there was more colour in his formerly pale face. He was as straight and as thin as ever, his fine head erect, without haughtiness. His dark eyes under their heavy lids had the same eagle glance. He was still, she concluded dispassionately, the handsomest man she had ever seen, even for an Austrian, the handsomest race on earth. He combined high intelligence with a classic regularity of feature, grace, dignity, and when the firm lips relaxed he had a delightful smile. If it had not been for his hair, very thick, white hair, he would have passed for little over 40. He wore loose grey travelling clothes, and every detail was as quietly faultless as ever. She went hastily to the speckled mirror beneath the antlers and surveyed herself anxiously. Her own travelling suit of dark green tweed, with its white silk shirt, was as carelessly perfect as his own, and the little green turban, with its shaded, drooping feather, extremely becoming. No colour set off her fairness like green, but she turned away with a sigh. It was not the eyes of the past 3 days that looked back at her. And then she remembered that he had not seen her since the Renaissance. The moment was not without its excitements. Their meeting was excessively formal. "Frau Gräfin?" "Excellence?" She lifted her hand. He raised it to his lips, and then he drew back and looked at her with penetrating but smiling eyes. "I had heard, of course," he said gallantly, "but I hardly was prepared. May I say, Frau Gräfin, that you look younger than when I had the pleasure of meeting you first?" "I assure you that I feel many years younger," she replied lightly. "May I add that I am delighted to see that you are in the best of health? Your rest in Switzerland has done you good, although it would have been better for Austria had it been shorter. Shall we sit down?" Two tall dignified bodies adjusted themselves to chairs both slippery and bumpy. He had closed the door behind him. "Now that the amenities are over, Excellence," she said with the briskness she had picked up from her American friends, "let us come to the point. I infer you did not take a day's journey and put up with this abominable hotel to tell me you are forming a federation of Austria with the South German states. You were sometimes kind enough to ask my help in the past, but I have no influence in Washington." "No, dear Gräfin, I do not need your assistance in Washington, but I do need it in Austria, and that is why I am here. But it was my intention to return to Austria almost immediately. Surely Judge Trent must have told you." "Yes, dear Gräfin, he told me, but he also told me other things. I shall not waste the little time at our disposal in diplomacy. He told me that you have the intention to marry a young American." There was the faintest accent on the young. Mary was annoyed to feel herself flushing, but she answered coldly, "It is quite true that I intend to marry Mr. Clavering, and I have come here to ask you to renounce that intention and to marry me instead." "You?" Mary almost rose from her chair. "What on earth do you mean?" "My dear Marie," he renounced formalities abruptly, "I think you will be able to recall that whether I wrapped my meaning in diplomatic phrases or conveyed it by the blunter method, it was always sufficiently clear to the trained understanding. I have never known a more trained or acute understanding than yours. I wish you to marry me, and I beg you to listen to my reasons." She gave the little foreign shrug she had almost forgotten. I will listen, of course. Need I add that I am highly honoured? If I were not so astonished, no doubt I should be more properly appreciative of that honour. Pray let me hear the reasons." Her tone was satirical, but she was beginning to feel vaguely uneasy. Neither her words nor her inflections ruffled the calm of that long immobile face, with its half-veiled, powerful eyes. "Let us avert all possible misunderstanding at the beginning," he said suavely. "I shall not pretend that I have fallen in love with you again, for although my gallantry prompts me to such a natural statement, I have not the faintest hope of deceiving you. What I felt for you once can never be revived, for I loved you more than I have ever loved any woman, and when such love burns itself out, its ashes are no more to be rekindled than the dust of the corpse. You thought I fell in love with my pretty young wife, but I was merely fond and appreciative of her. I knew that the end had come for us, and that if I did not recognize that sad fact, you would. My marriage, which, as you know, was imperative, afforded a graceful climax to a unique episode in the lives of both of us. There was no demoralizing interval of subterfuge and politely repressed ennui. On the other hand, it did not degenerate into one of those dreary and loosely knit liaisons lasting on into old age. We left each other on the heights, although the cliff was beginning to crumble. "Really, Moritz, I hope you have not come up here to indulge in sentimental reminiscence. Why rake up that old episode? I assure you I have practically forgotten it. And I can assure you that I have never felt less sentimental. I wish merely to emphasize the fact that it was complete in itself, and therefore as impossible of resuscitation as the dead. Otherwise you might naturally leap to the conclusion that I was an elderly romantic gentleman. Oh, never! It is obvious that you are inclined to be brutally frank, but, as you said, time is short. If what I said sounded brutal, it was merely to remind you that love, the intense, passionate love I have no doubt you feel for this young man who helps you realize your renewed youth, never lasts, and when this new love of yours burns itself out, you never had the reputation of being very constant, dear Marie, you will have an alien young man on your hands, while that remarkable brain of yours will be demanding its field of action. You are European, not American. Why, even your accent is stronger than mine. That may be due to an uncommonly susceptible ear, but as a matter of fact your mind has a stronger accent still. You became thoroughly Europeanized, one of us, and, I say this quite impartially, the most statesmanlike woman in Europe. Your mind was still plastic when you came to us, and your plastic years are long over, ma chère. If your mind had become as young as your body, you would have bitterly resented it. You were always very proud of that intellect of yours, and with the best of reasons." Mary was staring out of the window. She recalled that she had faced the fact of the old mind in the young brain when she first discovered that she loved Clavering. How could she have forgotten, for a few short weeks, and up there? She raised her eyes to the mountain. From where she sat she could not see the top. It looked like an impenetrable rampart rising to the skies. "Can you tell me with honesty and candour," he continued in those same gentle tones that had always reminded her of limpid waters running over iron, "and for all your subtlety your mind is too arrogant and fearless to be otherwise than honest au fond, that you believe you could remain satisfied with love alone? For more, let us say, than a year?" She moved restlessly. "Perhaps not. I had planned to live in Vienna. He would spend only a part of the year there with me. His own interests are here, of course. It would be a perfectly workable arrangement." "Are you sure? If you are, I must conclude that in the mental confusion love so often induces, you have lost temporarily your remarkable powers of clear and coherent thought. Do you not realize that you would no longer be Gräfin Zattiany, you would be Mrs. Lee Clavering? Do you imagine for a moment that you could play the great rôle in Austrian affairs you have set yourself, handicapped by an American name and an American husband? not with all your gifts, your wealth, your genius for playing on that complex instrument called human nature. Austria may be a republic of sorts, but it is still Austria. You would be an American and an outsider, a presumptuous interloper." She stared at him aghast. Oh, I had not thought of that. It seems incomprehensible. But I had never thought of myself as Mrs. Clavering. I have been Gräfin Zattiany so long. And your plans were well defined, and your ambition to play a great rôle on the modern European stage possessed you utterly, until you met this young man. Is it not so?" "Oh, yes, but—" "I understand. It must have been a quite marvellous experience after those barren years, to feel yourself glowing with all the vitalities of youth once more, to bring young men to your feet with a glance, and to fancy yourself in love—" "Fancy!" she interrupted him passionately. "I am in love, and more than I ever was with you. Until I met him I did not even guess that I had the capacity to love again. It was the last thing I wanted, abhorrent, but he has something for me that you, not even you, ever had, that I had given up hope of finding long before I met you." She stopped, colouring and hesitating. She had an intense desire to make this man understand, but she shivered, as if her proud reserve were a visible garment that she had torn off and flung at his feet, leaving her naked to his ironic gaze. He was leaning forward, regarding her through his veiled eyes. Their light was not ironic, but it was very penetrating. "And what is that something, Marie?" he asked softly. You know those things cannot be put into words." "I fancy they can. It is merely one more delusion of the senses, one of the imagination's most devilish tricks. I had it for you, and you for me, for a time. In the intimacies of either a liaison or matrimony, that supreme delusion is soon scattered, ma chère." "But I believe it!" She spoke obstinately, although that brawling stream seemed to take on a note of derision. "Do you? Not in the depths of your clear brain. The mist on top is dense and hot. But alas for those mists!" "I refuse to discuss it," she said haughtily. "Why do you wish to marry me yourself?" "Because I need your partnership as much as you need mine. Even if you returned to Austria unencumbered, you could accomplish less alone than with a man of equal endowments and greater power beside you. Two strong brains and characters with similar purpose can always accomplish more together than alone. I intend to rule and save Austria, and I need you, your help, your advice, your subtlety, your compelling fascination, and your great personality." "Do you intend to make yourself king?" she asked insolently, although his words had thrilled her. "You know that is a foolish question. I do not even use my title there. But I intend to make Vienna the capital of a great and powerful republic, and I therefore ask you to renounce, before it is too late, this commonplace and unworthy dream of young love, and stand beside me. Youth, real youth, and the best years of maturity are the seasons for love. You and I have sterner duties. Do you suppose that I would sacrifice Austria for some brief wild hope of human happiness? And you are only 2 years younger than I am. Nothing can alter the march of the years. Moreover, you owe to Austria this wonderful rejuvenescence of yours. Steinach is not an American." She stamped her foot. "You descend to quibbling, and I have more than repaid Austria all that I owe her." "You have given her money and service, but she expects more, and you pledged yourself to her before you left. And don't forget that she is the country of your deliberate adoption, a far more momentous thing than any mere accident of birth. You did not return to America when Zattiany died. You never even paid her a brief visit after your marriage. You would not be here now but for the imperative necessities of business. You are Austrian to your marrow. I had a rôle thrust on me, and I played it. My parents came to Europe every year until they died. When Zattiany went, there were no ties to draw me back, and habit is strong. But underneath, I don't believe that I have ever been other than Mary Ogden." She blushed as she said it, and he looked at her keenly. "I think I understand. He is a very clever young man, of an outstanding cleverness, I am told. Or it may be that he is merely in love, and love's delusions are infinite, for a time. I doubt if a young man with so brilliant an intellect would, if he faced himself in honest detachment, admit that he believed anything of the sort. Nor do you, my dear Marie, nor do you." She twisted her hands together, but would not raise her eyes. He bent forward again and said harshly, "Marie, glance inward. Do you see nothing that causes you to feel ashamed and foolish? Do you fail to recognize the indecency of a woman of your mental age permitting herself to fancy that she is experiencing the authentic passions of youth? Are you capable of creating life? Can you love with unsullied memory? Have you the ideals of youth, the plasticity, the hopes, the illusions? Have you still even that power of desperate mental passion, so often subordinating the merely physical, of the mature woman who seeks for the last time to find in love what love has not? The final delusion? No, Marie. Your revivified glands have restored to you the appearance and the strength of youth, but although you have played with a rôle that appealed to your vanity, to your histrionic powers, with yourself as chief audience, your natural desire to see if you could not be, to yourself, again, as young as you appear, you have no more illusion in your soul than when you were a withered old woman in Vienna." She looked at him with hostile but agonized eyes. "Your calculated brutality does not affect me in the least. You are merely one more victim of convention, like those old women in New York. It has never been, therefore it never can be. Many women are not able to bear children, even in youth." "It is your turn to quibble. Tell me, until you were attracted to this young man, attracted, no doubt, because he was so unlike the European of your long experience, had you deviated from the conclusion, arrived at many years before, that you had had enough of love, of sex, to satisfy any woman? You implied as much to me a few moments since. I know the mental part of you so well that I am positive the mere thought would have disgusted you. If you had been starved all your life it would be understandable, but you had experimented and deluded yourself again and again, and you were burnt out when you came to Vienna to live, burnt out not only physically but spiritually. Your imagination was as arid as a desert without an oasis. If any man had made love to you then, you would merely have turned on him your weary, disillusioned eyes, or laughed cynically at him and yourself. Your keen aesthetic sense would have been shocked. You were playing then an important and ambitious rôle. You had the greatest political salon in Vienna, in Europe, and you went away to rest that you might continue to play it, not that you might feel fresh enough once more to have liaisons like other foolish old women. But the part you played then was a bagatelle to the one awaiting you now. With your splendid mental gifts, your political genius, your acquired statecraft, your wealth, and your restored beauty, you could become the most powerful woman in Europe. But only as my wife. Even you are not strong enough to play the part alone. There is too much prejudice against women to permit you to pull more than hidden strings. Masculine jealousy of women is far more irritable in a democracy than in a monarchy, where women of rank are expected to play a decorative and tactful part in politics. But if they step down and come into conflict with ambitious men of the people, class jealousy aggravates sex jealousy. You might have a salon again and become a power somewhat in the old fashion, but you never would be permitted to play a great public rôle. But as the consort, I think the word will pass, of the president or chancellor, you could wield almost sensational power." "I should probably be quite overshadowed by you," she murmured, but she was hardly conscious of speaking. Her brain was whirling. "Your position would be too eminent for that, even if I wished it, which I assuredly should not. I value you too highly. Perhaps I am one of the few men in Europe who admit and believe that a woman may have as powerful and accomplished an intellect as any man. I did not appreciate your mind as you deserved when I loved you, but I did during those subsequent years in Vienna. You did not ask me to marry you then, when you appreciated me so highly. You never seemed to know whether you were talking to a man or a woman, when you were with me, and yet I was, possibly, more interesting psychologically than I had ever been. No man is interested in an old woman's psychology. I am not interested in your psychology today, and I did not ask you to marry me then for a great many reasons. I was too handicapped to play a great role myself, you will remember, nor could you have been of the same service to me, even if your fatigued mind had been refreshed by your stay in Hungary. You had lost the beauty and the energy, the power of ardent interest in the affairs of state, which have now been restored to you. With your rare gifts and your renewed youth, I repeat, you have it in your power to be the most famous woman in Europe, and perhaps the most useful. But not with a young alien husband. Not only would you automatically revert to the status of an American, but the dignity which, unlike so many women of your age who have been dames galantes, you took care to impress on the world, would be hopelessly sacrificed. Incredible! To spend yourself on a love affair, wantonly to throw away an historic career, merely because a young man has hypnotized you into the delusion that you may once more enjoy the passions of youth. Stop! You shall not! She sprang to her feet. Her face was drawn and pinched, but her eyes were blazing. Every word you say is for a purpose. If that were all, I should have hated him, as much as I hate you. My mind never dwelt on that, not for a moment. I never faced it. You don't know what you're talking about. Ah, but I do. He had risen also, and he put his hands on her shoulders. They were long, thin hands, but very powerful, and it seemed to her that they sank slowly through her flesh, until, however painlessly, they gripped the skeleton underneath. Look at me, Marie. Your Mary Ogden died many, many years ago. She died, I should say, at the first touch of Otto Zattiany. There was nothing in your new life to revive her, assuredly not your first lover. Certainly you were Marie Zattiany, the most subtle, complex, and fascinating woman in Europe when I met you, but abominably disillusioned even then. I revived your youth for a time, but never your girlhood. You have been able to deceive yourself here in the country of that girlhood for a time, with this interesting young gentleman in love with you, and, no doubt, extremely ardent. Oh! Her head sank, but she could not turn away, for his hands still gripped her shoulders. The roar of the stream sounded to her horrified ears like the crash of falling ruins. Listen, Marie, he said more gently. If I have been brutal, it was merely because there is no other way to fling you head first out of your fool's paradise. If I had not known the common sense that forms the solid lower stratum of your mind, I should not have come here to say anything at all. You would not have been worth it. But remember, Marie, that under this new miracle of science, the body may go back, but never the mind. You, your ego, your mind, yourself, are no younger than your 58 hard-lived years. And what object in being young again, for any of us, if we are to make the same old mistakes? Remember that when you were as young as you look now, you had no such opportunity offered you as in this terrible period of European history. Nor could you have taken advantage of it if you had, for mere mental brilliancy and ambition cannot take the place of political experience and an intellect educated by the world. It may be that we shall both be destroyed, that our efforts will avail nothing, and we shall all be swallowed up in chaos. But at least we shall have done what we could. And I know you well enough to believe that such an implacable end would give you greater satisfaction than dallying in the arms of a handsome young husband. He pushed her back into her chair and resumed his own. Would you like to smoke? He asked. Yes. She looked at him with bitter eyes, but she had recaptured her threatened composure. He regarded her with admiration, but they smoked in silence for several moments. Then he spoke again. "You remember Elkazaki, I suppose. She was several years older than you, and one of the dames galantes of her day. She has taken the treatment and looks many years younger, at least, than when she was a painted old hag with a red wig. She is still forced to employ artifice, but she has lovers again, and that is all she did it for. Vienna is highly amused. No doubt all women of her sort will take it for no other purpose. But many of the intellectual women of Europe are taking it, too, and with the sole purpose of reinvigorating their mental faculties and recapturing the physical endurance necessary to their work. I happen to know of a woman scientist, Frau Bloch, who is now working 16 hours a day, and she had had a bitter struggle with her enfeebled forces to work at all. Lorenz is no more remarkable. He seems to be the only disciple besides yourself that this country has heard of, but I could name 100 men out of my own knowledge who are, once more, working with all the vigour of youth." "Yes," she interrupted sarcastically, "and without a thought of women, of course." "Probably not." He waved his hands negligently. "But incidentally, that is where men have the supreme advantage of women. The woman is an incident in their lives, even when sincerely in love, and if these men indulge occasionally in the pleasures of youth, or even marry young wives, the world will not be interested. But with women who renew their youth and return to its follies, it will be quite another matter. If they are not made the theme of obscene lampoons, they may count themselves fortunate. There will certainly be verbal lampoons in private." "Orthodoxy, orthodoxy!" "Possibly. But orthodoxy is a fixed habit of mind. The average man and woman hug their orthodoxies and spit their venom on those that outrage them. How it may be some years hence, when the cure for senescence has become a commonplace, I do not pretend to say. But so it is to-day. Personally, no doubt, you would be indifferent, for you have a contemptuously independent mind. But your career and your usefulness would be at an end." "And suppose I am quite indifferent to that?" "Ah, but you are not. I will not say that I have killed Mary Ogden during this painful hour, for it is impossible to kill the dead, but I have exorcised her ghost. She will not come again. If you marry this young man, it will be out of defiance, or possibly out of a mistaken consideration for him, although he will be an object for sympathy later on. And you will marry him as Marie Zattiany, without an illusion left in that clear brain of yours, from which the mists have been blown by the cold wind of truth. And in a year, if you can stand self-contempt and ineffable ennui so long, you will leave him, resume your present name, the name by which Europe knows you, and return to us. But it may be too late. Vienna would still be laughing. The Viennese are a light-hearted race, and a lax, but when they laugh they cease to take seriously the subject of that good-natured amusement. It is not ascetic, you know, it is not ascetic. Are you really quite indifferent, Marie?" She shrugged and rose. "It must be time for luncheon," she said. "It will no doubt be horrible, but at least we can have it in here. The public dining-room would be impossible. I will find Mr. Dinwiddie and ask him to order it." End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Black Oxen by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 56. When the men returned from their fishing trip at 6 o'clock, they saw several of the women on the lake, but there was no one in the living-room. Clavering tapped at Mr. Dinwiddie's door, but as there was no answer, concluded that he and Mary had not yet returned from Huntersville. He was too desirous of a bath and clean clothes, however, to feel more than a fleeting disappointment, and it was not until his return to his room that he saw a letter lying on the table. It was addressed in Mary's handwriting, and he stared at it in astonishment for a second, then tore it open. It was dated Huntersville, Monday afternoon, and it read: Dear Lee, Mr. Dinwiddie will tell you that unforeseen circumstances have arisen, which compel me to go to New York for a few days. It is excessively annoying, but unavoidable, and I do not ask you to follow me, as I should hardly be able to see anything of you. If there is a prospect of being detained, it will not be worth while to return, and I'll let you know at once, on Thursday night by telephone, and then I hope you will not wait for the others, but join me here. Indeed, dear Lee, I wish this need not have happened, but at least we had 3 days. M. Clavering read this letter twice, hardly comprehending its purport. She made no mention of Judge Trent. The whole thing was ambiguous, curt. A full explanation was his right. Moreover, it was the reverse of a love letter. Even its phrases of regret were formal. Something was wrong. He put on his clothes hurriedly in order to go in search of Dinwiddie, but before he had finished he heard a sound in the next room, and opened the connecting door unceremoniously. Mr. Dinwiddie braced himself as he saw Clavering's set face. "Too bad," he muttered, but Clavering cut him short. "I want the truth. What took Mary to New York?" "Surely she has explained in her letter." "She explained nothing. There's some mystery here, and I want it cleared up at once." "By God, I'll tell you," Mr. Dinwiddie burst out. "Mary exacted no promise. I suppose she took for granted I'd not tell you, for she told me what she had written. But if she had, I'd tell you anyhow. I'd rather break a promise to a woman than lie to a friend. Believe men should stand by one another. She went down there this morning to meet Hohenhauer." "Hohenhauer?" Clavering's face turned almost black. "Yes, Trent telegraphed me yesterday that Hohenhauer was arriving at Huntersville last night and would come up here in the morning to see Mary. He said the matter was most important. I went to Mary's room after you came in from the lake and showed her the message. She was extremely annoyed, and said at first that she wouldn't see him, but I pointed out that she couldn't possibly avoid it. Then she said he shouldn't come up here, and was very emphatic about it. The only thing to do was to take her down. Of course you will be reasonable and see there was nothing else to be done." "What did that infernal blackguard want of her? And why did she go off with him?" "She didn't go off with him. She hired a car directly after lunch, intending to drive as far as Saratoga and take a train from there. She left Hohenhauer to cool his heels until it was time to take the local for the Adirondack Express. She could easily have taken him along, but I think she was meting out punishment." "Punishment?" "Yes. They had a private conference for nearly 2 hours, and, whatever happened, it put her in an infernally bad humour. She scarcely opened her mouth during luncheon, and as Mary is a woman of the world, used to concealing her feelings, I thought it highly significant. She looked as if she were in a secret frozen rage. Hohenhauer, however, was quite himself, and the meal, corned beef and cabbage, went off very well." "What did he want of her?" "Of that I haven't the vaguest idea. Something momentous, beyond a doubt. If I may hazard a guess, it has something to do with this special mission of his, and it is quite possible that he has asked her to go to Washington, insisted upon it, appealing to her love of Austria. I confess I don't see what she can accomplish there, for she never did have any Washington connections. Of course she could get letters from Trent and trust to her personal power and prestige, but let me tell you that she didn't do it to please him. She looked as if she hated him." "Is he still in love with her? Are you sure he didn't come here to ask her to marry him?" "If he did, he had his journey for his pains, although I can see that it would be a highly desirable combination from his point of view. But he's not in love with her. I'll stake all I know of men on that." "You are sure?" "As sure as that I'm alive." "Well, I take the morning train for New York." "Lee," said Mr. Dinwiddie impressively, "take the advice of an old man who has seen a good deal of men and women in his day, and stay where you are until you hear from Mary. Some sort of crisis has arisen, no use blinking the fact. But if you burst in on her now, while she is Madame Zattiany, encased in a new set of triple-plated armour, you may ruin all your chances of happiness. Whatever it is, let her work it out, and off, by herself. I made her promise she would not leave the country without seeing you again, for I didn't know what might be in the wind, and when she had given her word she added that she had not the least intention of not seeing you again, and that it was quite possible that she would return to the camp. If you go down you'll spoil everything. I suppose I can trust you, Din, but I've seen plainly that you don't want me to marry her." "That's true enough. I want nothing less, for your sake, and Hohenhauer will be a far more suitable match for her. But I don't believe you even question my faith." "No, I don't. You're a brick, Din. But I'm unspeakably worried, almost terrified. I have never felt that I really knew her. She may have only imagined, but that's impossible. How in God's name am I to sit around here for 3 days and twiddle my thumbs?" "Don't. Take one of the men and go off on a 3 days' camp. Climb Mount Moose. That will give you no chance to think. All your thinking will be in your muscles." "And suppose she should return, or telegraph me to go to her?" "If she returns and finds you gone, it'll serve her right, and she won't telegraph before Thursday, if she's going to Washington. Now take my advice and don't be a fool." Clavering shrugged his shoulders, but he set his lips. "Very well, I won't follow her. Nor will I forgive her in a hurry, either. That's healthy. Give her a piece of your mind, have a good row, and then make it up. But let me tell you, my dear boy, that she was horrified at the thought of that man coming up here, and she only refrained from telling you of the summons, so to speak, because she wanted to spare you any anxiety. There's no doubt in my mind that she's as much in love with you as you are with her." "You have none, I suppose?" "None, particularly lately. I hadn't told you, but I had intended in a day or two to ask you if you would let me have the camp for a few weeks. We intended to marry in Huntersville the day the rest of you went out." Mr. Dinwiddie whistled. No wonder she was furious at having her preliminary honeymoon disturbed. But if that is the case, of course she'll return. You're more than welcome to the camp, and I'll send whatever you need from time to time. You've only to command me. It makes it all the more comprehensible. Whatever it was that man said to her, she wanted to get over it by herself before coming back to the place where she had forgotten that Hohenhauers and politics existed. I could see how it was with her there. She looked exactly as she used to in the old days, and I don't doubt she felt like it too. No wonder she resented being forced back into the role of Madame Zattiany, or Gräfin, Countess, as he calls her. You must let her thresh it out by herself. You believe she will come back. If that was your plan, I assuredly do. There isn't a spark of human affection between those two, and Mary never placed herself in any man's power. I am more and more inclined to believe that he appealed to her for help in his mission here, whatever it is, and it's not so difficult to guess, and that, against her inclination and out of her love for Austria, she consented. Well, it's no use to speculate. There's the supper bell. I'll decide in the morning whether I go off for a tramp or not. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Black Oxen by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 57. Clavering slept when he first went to bed, for he was healthily tired, but he awoke suddenly at midnight with body refreshed and mind abnormally clear. He knew that he would sleep no more that night, and he put on his trousers and coat over his pyjamas, thrust his feet into bedroom slippers, and went out into the living-room. There he put a log on the fire and paced up and down, not unlike a tiger round its cage. He felt as if black bats were flying about his brain, each charged with a different portent of disaster. Once more the unreality of the whole affair overwhelmed him. How could he have been so fatuous as to believe that he had really won such a woman? He remembered his first impression, that she was on a plane above, apart. They hadn't an interest in common, not even a memory that antedated their meeting a few short weeks ago. She had lived a life of which he knew nothing outside of European novels and memoirs. She had known nothing of any other world until he had introduced her to his friends, and he made no doubt that her interest in them was about as permanent as a highly original comedy on the stage would inspire. There was nothing, literally, between them but a mutual, irresistible attraction, and that bond recognized so unerringly by both. That bond, would it hold? Had this man offered her something that would make love seem insignificant and trivial? She, who had a surfeit of love long since, whose eyes had looked 1,000 years old until he had given her mind back its youth, as the great Vienna biologist had rejuvenated her body. He was entirely indifferent to her old love affair with Hohenhauer. It was those years of political association and mutual interdependence in Vienna that he feared. He had, when he first met her, appraised her as a woman to whom power was the breath of life, ambition, in the grand manner, incarnate. She had all the appearance and the air of a woman to whom the wielding of power, however subtly, was an old story. He recalled that terrifying suggestion of concealed, ruthless forces behind those charming manners, those feminine wiles, had almost made him resolve to avoid her like the plague. And then he had fallen madly in love with her and forgotten everything but the woman. He had divined even before these last miraculous days that she had looked upon love with abhorrence for almost half as many years as he had lived, an abhorrence rooted in a profound revulsion of body and mind and spirit. For nearly 20 years that revulsion had endured and eaten into the very depths of her being. He had a sudden blaze of enlightenment. She had frequently alluded to that lodge of hers in the Dolomites, and their sojourn there together, but always in the terms of romance. She had never given him a glance of understanding, and she had put off the wedding until the last possible moment. If she had really been as eager as himself, she would have left her power of attorney with Trent and started for Austria 6 weeks ago. Or the papers could have been sent to her to sign, if her signature were imperative. And in spite of the fact that everybody had taken the engagement for granted, she had, with wholly insufficient reasons, as he saw, now that he was removed from the influence of her plausible and dominating self, refused to announce it. Could it be that in the depths of her mind, unadmitted by her consciousness, she had never intended to marry him? Was that old revulsion paramount? 16 years, a long time, and nothing in life is more corroding than habit. Perhaps, as long as they were down there in New York, but not up here, that he would be willing to swear. There had been another revolution, involuntary perhaps, but the stronger for that, and every shackle that memory and habit can forge had dropped from her. She had been youth incarnate. The proof was in her joyful consent to marry him immediately and remain in the mountains, and then her complete surrender of the future into his hands. She had during those 3 brief days loved him wholly, and without a shadow in her soul. But now, whatever had happened, she was not Mary Ogden tonight, hastening to New York, nor would she be when in her own house on the morrow. She might hate Hohenhauer, but his mere presence would have made the past live again. She must have known, when she went down that mountain, that even with her strong will and powers of self-delusion, things could not be quite the same again, not even if she had returned with Dinwiddie. Why in heaven's name had she been so mad as to go? She could have sent Hohenhauer a peremptory refusal to see him, and then gone off on a camping trip that could have lasted until he gave up the game. She must have been mad, mad. And he did not believe for a moment that she had gone to Washington. She had gone home to think. And if he followed Dinwiddie's advice and remained here, she might think too long. And if he followed and insisted upon seeing her, the result might be more fatal still. He knew nothing of those personalities she may have concealed from him. For all he knew, she might have depths in her nature as black as the bottomless pit. And God only knew what the man had said to her. Should he let her fight it out by herself? What in heaven's name should he do? Whatever happened, this divine interval, like some exquisitely adjusted musical instrument, had been hopelessly jarred out of tune. He almost hoped she would not return. Let it remain a perfect memory. They could marry in New York and return here when she was his wife, if he had not already lost her. What in God's name was the thing for him to do? He'd go mad if he stayed here, and if he went he might regret it for the rest of his days. Why could not light be vouchsafed him? Gora. Fortunately he knew her room, for he had carried up her luggage. He ran lightly up the stairs and tapped on her door. A startled, sleepy voice answered. He opened the door and put in his head. "Come downstairs at once, Gora," he said peremptorily. "I must talk to you." She came down in a moment, clad in a scarlet kimono, her hair hanging in thick braids. With her large round forehead exposed, she looked not unlike a gnome, but curiously young. "What on earth is the matter, Clavey?" she asked, as she pushed her chair as close to the fire as possible. "It has something to do with this sudden trip of Mary's, I suppose. Mr. Dinwiddie said she had been called to New York on important business, and the others accepted the explanation as a matter of course. But I'll confess I wondered." Clavering, still too nervous to sit down, jerked out the whole story, omitting only the old love affair with the man who had exercised so strong an influence on Mary Zattiany's later life. "You see," he concluded, "there are two things. Austria had taken the place in her affections that women of her age generally concentrate on human beings. It became almost a sacrament. And then, for nearly 20 years, she had hated everything in men but their minds. Sex was not only dead, but a detestable memory. After that rejuvenescence, she had never cast a thought to loving any man again. That mental habit, at least, was fixed. When I met her, she was a walking intellect. I thought I had changed all that. Up here, I had not a doubt left. But now, I don't know. Put that cold-blooded mind of yours on it, and tell me what to do." "Let me think a minute, Clavey." As he resumed his restless march, Gora set her mind travelling out of the mountains and far to the south, and tried to penetrate the brain of Mary Zattiany. She could not visualize her in the bed of a casual hotel, or sitting in the chair of a parlour car, so she skipped the interval, and saw her next day in that intimate room of hers upstairs, the room, assuredly, where she would think out her problem. Gora had studied Madame Zattiany with all the avidity of the artist for a rare human theme, and she believed that she knew her as well as Clavering did, if not better. She had also not failed to observe Prince Hohenhauer's picture, and had read the accompanying text with considerable interest, an interest augmented, not unnaturally, by his exceeding good looks. That same day she had met a Viennese at dinner who had talked of him with enthusiasm and stated definitely that he was the one hope of Austria. Gora Dwight was a very ambitious woman, and revelled in the authority that fame and success had brought her. She was also as disillusioned in regard to men as any unmarried woman could be, although quite aware that if she had lacked a gift to entice her emotions to her brain, she no doubt would even now be looking out for some man to fall in love with. But her pride was spared a succession of humiliating anticlimaxes, and she had learned, younger than most women, or even men, that power, after sex has ceased from troubling, is the dominant passion in human nature. And Madame Zattiany was 20 years older than herself, and had drained the jewelled chalice to the dregs. And for many years more she had enjoyed power, revelled in it, looked forward, Gora made no doubt, to a greater and greater exercise of it. Power had become the master passion of her life. Like men in the same case, she had indulged herself, during a period of enforced inaction, with an exciting love adventure. That she had fallen in love, romantically in love, with this young man, whom so many women loved, and who, no doubt, had given her the full benefit of all his pent-up ardours, Gora could imagine those love scenes. She had not questioned. In spite of Madame Zattiany's carefully composed tones when speaking of him, and her avoidance of so much as the exchange of a meaning glance with him in public. Up here, Mary had ceased to be a woman of the world. She had looked like a girl of 20, and that she was in love and recklessly happy in the fact was for all to see. That had been one of her most interesting divagations to the novelist, Gora Dwight, but a phase. Gora was not deluded. And this man Hohenhauer had brought her to her senses, no doubt of that either, to a mind both warmly imaginative and coldly analytical. And what had he come up here for, except to ask her to marry him, to share his power? She dismissed the Washington inference with the contempt it deserved. Mr. Dinwiddie was a very experienced and astute old gentleman, but he always settled on the obvious like a hen on a porcelain egg. What a manifest destiny! What an ideal match! She sighed, almost envying her. But it would be almost as interesting to write about as to experience. After all, a novelist had things all her own way, and that was more than even the Zattianys could hope for. Then she remembered poor Clavering, and looked up at him with eyes that were wholly sympathetic. "I don't think there's a doubt," she said, "that Prince Hohenhauer came up here to ask her to marry him. You can see for yourself what such a match would mean for him, for aside from the indisputable genius of hers, trained in later years by himself, she has great wealth and few scruples, and where he failed to win men to his purpose, she, with her superlative charm, and every feminine intuition sharpened by an uncommon experience of men and public life, would succeed. She may hate him, as Mr. Dinwiddie says, for the moment, but even if she continued to hate him, that would not prevent her from marrying him, if she believed he could help her to power. If it had not been for you, I don't believe she would have hesitated a moment." "Do you mean to say you believe she'll throw me over?" demanded Clavering fiercely. "I think you're in danger, and if I were you, I'd throw Mr. Dinwiddie's advice to the winds and take the morning train for New York." "Don't you believe that she loves me?" "Oh, yes, as love goes." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that Madame Zattiany has long since reached the age when power means more than love, in a woman of that calibre. But you, in turn, have tremendous power over her. Sweep her off her feet again and make her marry you." "You don't believe she's gone to Washington?" "I do not. If that was all he wanted of her, why didn't he telephone? I am sure he could be ambiguous enough to defeat the curiosity of any listeners in. But a man of that sort does not ask a woman to marry him over the telephone." "But Din thinks—" "How long do you think you can stand inaction?" "Not another hour, by God! I'm nearly mad as it is." "I thought so. You're about the last man on earth equipped to play the waiting game." "You don't think she means to return here?" "Never. She's too much of an artist for one thing. She might be willing to begin a new chapter, but she knows that asterisks in the wrong place are fatal. This interruption has done for your idyll." "I had thought the same thing." He sighed heavily. "Oh, yes, Clavey dear, you are an artist yourself. No matter what happens, never forget that it is your destiny to be a great one." "Artist be damned. God, if I lose her, I'll never write another line." "I don't doubt you think so, but you're only just beginning to know yourself. You got a few glimpses, I should think, while you were writing that play." "Don't mention that play to me. I hate it. If I hadn't let myself go with the damned thing, I'd have had my wits about me and would have married her off-hand." "I wonder, was she so very anxious to marry?" He turned cold. Fear flared up again. "What do you mean by that?" "Well, I don't know that I mean anything, except that, like all women, she probably wanted to enjoy the thrilling hopes and fears and uncertainties of that never-to-be-repeated prelude to the limit. Now, better wake up, Larsing, and order the car if you mean to catch the morning train. If you don't want to go back to bed, I'll sit up with you. You can sleep on the train." End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Black Oxen by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 58. He left the next morning in a dense fog. As Larsing rowed him across the lake, he could not see its surface nor the wall of trees on the opposite bank, and in a moment the camp was obliterated. Only Gora and Larsing knew of his departure. Even Dinwiddie was still asleep. Larsing had made him a cup of coffee, and Gora had packed his bag, moving like a mouse in his room. She kissed him good-bye and patted him on the back. "I'll go out myself in a day or two," she said. "You may need me down there." The fog thinned gradually, and the Ford made its usual comfortless speed down the mountain. When they reached Huntersville, the valley was bathed in early morning sunlight, and Huntersville, asleep, shared the evanescent charm of the dawn. It was a beautiful and a peaceful scene, and Clavering, whose spirits had descended into utter gloom while enwrapped in that sinister fog, accepted it as a happier portent, and when he was so fortunate as to find an empty drawing-room on the express, he went to bed and slept until the porter awoke him at Tarrytown. It was his first impulse to rush direct to Murray Hill, but he knew the folly of doing anything of the sort. He needed a bath and a shave and a fortifying dinner. He concluded that it would be unwise to telephone, and at 9 o'clock he approached her house, reasonably calm and quite determined to have his own way. But the house was dark from cellar to roof. Every window was closed, although it was a warm night. He sprang up the steps and rang the bell. He rang again, and then kept his finger on the button for nearly 5 minutes. He descended into the area, but the iron bars were new and immovable. Moreover, a policeman was sauntering opposite. He approached the man in a moment and asked him if he knew whether the house had been open earlier in the evening. Yes, the officer told him. He had seen some of the servants go in about half an hour ago. Clavering walked away slowly. If Mary had gone to Washington, why had the servants not answered his ring? It was too early for them to be in bed. Then his spirits, which had descended to 0, rose jubilantly. Hohenhauer! It was against him she was barricading herself. No doubt she would feel herself in a state of siege as long as the man remained in the country. He went to the nearest hotel and telephoned. He was prepared to be told, after an interminable wait, that there was no answer, but in a moment he heard the voice of the butler. Obeying a sudden impulse, he disguised his own. "I should like to speak to Madame Zattiany." "Madame has retired." He hung up. He had ascertained that she was at home, and his spiritual barometer ascended another notch. He'd see her tomorrow if he spent the day on her doorstep. He bought an evening paper, picked out a new play, and spent a very agreeable evening at the theatre. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Black Oxen by Gertrude Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 59. His nervous excitement returned next morning, but he forced himself to eat a good breakfast and read his newspapers. He was determined to show her that he was completely master of himself. She should be able to draw no unfavourable comparisons with Hohenhauer, whose composure had probably not been ruffled in 40 years. His comparative youth might be against him, but, after all, a man of 34 was no infant, and in some respects he was as old as he would ever be. He knew the value of dignity and self-control, and whatever might come, he would sacrifice neither. But he sighed heavily. Whatever might come. But he refused to dwell on alternatives. It was 10 o'clock when he presented himself at Madame Zattiany's door. As he had hoped, his ring was answered. Hohenhauer was not the man to call on a woman at 10 in the morning. The footman permitted himself to stare, and said deprecatingly, "I am very sorry, Mr. Clavering, but Madame told me to admit no visitors." "Did she?" He entered and tossed his hat on a high Italian chair. "Kindly tell her that I am in the library and shall remain there until she is ready to come down." The man hesitated. But after all, Clavering had had the run of the house, and it was possible that Madame believed him still to be in the mountains. At all events, he knew determination when he saw it, and marched reluctantly up the stairs. Clavering went into the library. He was filled with an almost unbearable excitement, but at least the man's assertion that she was at home to no one cemented his belief that she meant to see nothing further of Hohenhauer. He glanced round the beautiful mellow room, so full of memories. After all, he had been happier here than he had ever been in his life, until they had gone up to the woods. The room's benignant atmosphere seemed to enfold him, calmed his fears, subdued that inner quiver. Surely she would surrender to its influence and to his, whatever had happened. He knew she had always liked him the better because he did not make love to her the moment they met, but to-day he would take her by surprise, give her no time to think. But, as Mrs. Oglethorpe had once told him, a clever man is no match for a still cleverer woman. At the end of 15 minutes the footman opened the door and announced, "Madame is in the car, sir, and begs you will join her." Clavering repressed a violent start and an imprecation, but there was nothing to do but follow the man. Fortunately, he did not have what was known as an open countenance. Let her have her own way for the moment. He could, and would, return with her. For the moment he felt primitive enough to beat her. She was wearing a black dress with a long jade necklace and a large black hat, and, as he ran down the steps, he had time further to observe that she was even whiter than usual and had dark rings under her eyes. "It is too beautiful a morning to remain indoors," she said, as she gave him her hand and he took the seat beside her. "We will drive in the park and then up the river for a bit." She was completely at her ease, and she was the Madame Zattiany of the night he had met her. But she did not elaborate the role, and asked him how he had left his friends at the camp, and if he had enjoyed his fishing trip. "Enough of this," he interrupted, when he had mastered his excitement at being close to her once more. After all, he had expected something of the sort. She was just the woman to fall back on her infernal technique. "I know that you went down to Huntersville to meet Hohenhauer, and that the result of that interview was an abrupt flight from me, possibly from him. I want the truth." Her face had flushed, but as the colour ebbed she looked almost waxen. "I relied on Din." "Well, I guessed it, and he admitted the fact, and if he hadn't I'd have come after you anyhow. Your note was enough to tell any man something was wrong. I shall not be put off, and I will have an answer to my questions. Do you love me no longer?" "Oh, yes," she said softly, "I love you." But when he tried to take her hand she drew it away. "Do you still intend to marry me?" "Won't you give me a few days more to think it over?" "No, I will not. Do you need them? Haven't you already made up your mind?" She sighed and looked out of the window. They were driving up Fifth Avenue, and the bright street was full of colour and life. The buses and motors were filled with women on their way to the shops whose gay windows were the most enticing in the world. New York, in this her river of delight, looked as if she had not a care in the world. Madame Zattiany did not speak again until they were in the park. "I have promised to marry you, remember, and I do not lightly go back on my word. But I had intended to ask if you would be willing to let me go alone to Vienna for 6 months, and then join me." "After I had lost you completely? I shall marry you here to-day, or not at all. I love you, but I'll not let you play with me. I'll go to Austria with you, and you may do as you choose when you get there. You'll belong to me, and I'll make the best of it." "If I married you now, it would not be worth my while to return to Austria. You see, I'd be an American. I'd no longer be Gräfin Zattiany. I could accomplish nothing. It is the strangest thing in the world, but I never had thought of changing my name." "Until Hohenhauer reminded you, I suppose. Well, I could have told you that myself. I had counted on it, if you want to know the truth." "Ah, then you counted on that to have you altogether, yes." And then he added hastily, But up there, you must believe this, I never gave it a thought after you promised to marry me at once." He doubted if she had listened to this protest that there had been an hour when in the complete bearing of his soul he had been above plotting and subterfuge. She was still looking out of the window. He saw her long, upward-curving nostril grow rigid. But she said quietly, "And what do you think you would have done with me, Lee, after we were on the plane of common mortals once more? Transports do not last for ever, you know, and we are not heedless young things with no thought of the future. You have acknowledged there is no place for me here, and there would be no place for me in Europe if I married you. Do you wonder that I came away to think, after Prince Hohenhauer, who, remember, knows me far better than you do, pointed out the inexorable truth? What would you do with me, Lee?" He stared out of the window in his turn, at the tender greens of the park. He could hear the birds singing. Spring. The chill of winter was in the car, and it emanated from the woman beside him. "I don't know," he said miserably. "I only know that I love you, and would take any chances. But you see, although it is my misfortune to love you, I recognize that there is a long generation between us. I thought I had spanned it, but do you realize that we have literally nothing to give each other but love? That we are as unlike— Oh, yes, I realized all that the night you left, but I don't care. Cannot you trust me? There is that long generation, Lee, and it is I who have lived it, not you. Lived it and outlived the woman who began it. The gods in a sportive mood made us for each other and then sent me into the world too soon. I must go on. It is not like me to go back, nor to remain becalmed. Hohenhauer told me many cruel truths. Those women at my dinner might have enlightened me, if I had not deliberately bandaged the eyes of my mind. I chose to forget them at once. But Hohenhauer— She shuddered. Well, although I was infuriated with him at the time, what he said was true, every word. I must go forward. I cannot go back. He appealed to your ambition, your love of power, I suppose." "He showed me to myself for exactly what I am," she said emphatically. "No appeal would have made the slightest impression on me if I had really and finally returned to my Mary Ogdenhood up there in the woods of my real youth. My God, what incredible folly! What powers of self-delusion! But we both have that memory. Let us be grateful. I at least shall hold it apart from all memories as long as I live." "Are you going to marry that man?" "That is so purely incidental that it is not worth talking about. I came away to think out my own problem. I love you, and I believe that I shall always love you. But I don't see any way out. I have killed once and for all that fatal talent for self-delusion that I had thought was as dead, well, as dead as my love for Moritz Hohenhauer, and nothing could be more dead than that. My brain feels like a crystal house illuminated by searchlights, strong enough to penetrate every corner, but not strong enough to blind. I could never, if I would, deceive myself again, nor make another mistake, so far as human prescience will serve me." He looked at her hands. Her gloves were black suede, and they made those hands look smaller, but he had an idea that if he lifted one it would fall of its own rigid weight. He made no comment, and she said in a moment, "Perhaps you may have an inspiration. If there is any solution for us, believe me when I say it would make me as happy as it could make you." But her hands did not relax. "What is the solution, Lee?" He had buried his face in his hands. "There is none, I suppose, unless you have the courage to drive down to the City Hall and marry me, and—" he lifted his head with a faint gleam of hope— "remember that you are young again. You have many years to live. You are a woman. Can you go through life without love?" "Far better than with it. Love is a very old story to me," she said deliberately. "It could never be to me again the significant thing it is even to the woman of middle age, much less to the young. And now, with a world falling to ruins, in the most critical period of its history, to imagine that love as any but a passing significance— oh no, my friend, oh no! Let those women who have it in their power to repeople the earth which has lost so many millions of its sons, cherish that delusion of the supreme importance of love, but not I. I have had my dream, but it is over. If we had met in Vienna, it would never have claimed me at all. In New York one may be serious in the romantic manner when one is temporarily free from care. But seriousness is of another and portentous quality over there. Why did you ask me to wait 6 months and then join you in Vienna?" She turned her eyes on him with what he had once called her look of ancient wisdom. There was not an expiring flicker of youth in them, nor in the faint smile on her lips. He had thrown himself back in his corner and folded his arms. He had no desire to attract the attention of the passers-by, but his face was as white as a dark man's can ever be, and his eyes were both stricken and bitter. "To give you time to get over it," she said, "to write another play, to settle down with your old life, and look back upon this episode as upon a dream, a wonderful dream, but difficult to recall as anything more substantial." "So I inferred." "And you have not the courage to marry me, here, to-day?" "No, that is the one thing for which I have no courage whatever. In 3 months I should hate you and myself. I should not have even one memory in my life that I had no wish to banish. The sustaining memory of love undestroyed I may take back with me now. Courage! I could contemplate going back to certain death at the hands of an assassin, or in another revolution, to stand on the edge of the abyss, the last human being alive in Europe, and look down upon her expiring throes before I went over the brink myself. But I have not the courage to marry you." Clavering picked up the tube and told the driver to stop. He closed the door and lifted his hat. "Good-bye, Madame Zattiany," he said, and as the driver was listening, he added, "A pleasant journey." Chapter 59. End of Black Oxen, by Gertrude Atherton.